In the summer of 1943, the tide of war had begun to shift. In North Africa, German and Italian forces faced defeat. The Allies pushed them back through Tunisia, capturing thousands of German soldiers in the process. These men were tired, hungry, and worn down from months of fighting. Many believed they would be executed or sent to miserable prison camps if they fell into enemy hands. Nazi propaganda had told them that Americans were brutal and would treat them as animals. Still, they surrendered in large numbers, their units shattered and without supplies. Once captured, these German soldiers were marched to Allied-controlled ports and placed on transport ships. The journey across the Atlantic was long and dangerous. U-boats prowled the waters, and every soldier knew there was a chance the ship could be sunk before reaching its destination. Guards kept a close watch during the voyage. Prisoners were kept below deck in cramped quarters, with little to occupy their minds but fear and uncertainty. The destination for many was not Europe or North Africa, but the United States itself. It may have seemed strange to send prisoners so far from the battlefield, but the U.S. had a reason. American farms and factories needed labor. By housing POWs in the U.S., the military could keep them secure while also filling labor shortages. Large camps were built across the country. Two examples were Camp Swift in Texas and Camp Algona in Iowa. These camps were built to hold thousands of men, with barracks, kitchens, guard towers, and fences. When the first groups of prisoners arrived, they were shocked by what they saw. Their trip began with processing. The men were stripped of their old uniforms, which were filthy and often crawling with lice. German military clothing had been worn for months in the desert and was in poor condition. Many of the men were emaciated, with open sores or untreated injuries. They expected rough handling and humiliation. Instead, they were ordered to line up for showers. For many, this moment was filled with terror. Nazi propaganda had told them about gas chambers and mass killings. When they were told to undress and step into large rooms with showerheads, some panicked. A few refused to move forward, certain they were about to be killed. Guards and interpreters had to calm them down, explaining that the showers were for cleaning, not execution. Slowly, the men entered. The warm water and soap were a shock to their senses. Many had not bathed properly in weeks or months. Some stood frozen, overwhelmed by relief. Others wept openly as dirt and sweat washed away. After the shower, each man was examined by a medical team. Doctors checked for injuries, infections, and diseases. This was required by the Geneva Convention, which laid out rules for the treatment of prisoners. Once cleared by the medical staff, the men received new clothing. The uniforms were plain and clearly marked to identify them as prisoners, but they were clean and intact. For soldiers used to ragged, blood-stained gear, this was another surprise. They were also given shoes that actually fit, which for many was a small but meaningful comfort. The camp itself ran with strict rules but also a sense of order that the prisoners had not expected. Meals were served on schedule. The food was plain but nutritious, often better than what German soldiers had eaten on the front lines. Barracks were kept clean. There were designated areas for exercise and even recreation. For many Germans, the most jarring experience was seeing the contrast between what they had been told and what they were now living. They had been prepared to hate their captors. Instead, they encountered guards who treated them firmly but fairly. There was no random violence or deliberate cruelty. Some prisoners began to question what they had been taught about the enemy and about their own government. American officials had a clear strategy. By following the Geneva Convention and treating prisoners well, they hoped to encourage other German units to surrender. If word spread that life in American camps was humane, soldiers on the battlefield might be less willing to fight to the last man. This approach also served a practical purpose. A well-run camp was easier to manage. It reduced the risk of uprisings or escape attempts. POWs were not left idle. Many were assigned to work details outside the camp. They harvested crops, cut timber, and repaired roads. These tasks were important because so many American men were overseas fighting. The prisoners were paid in camp currency, which could be used to buy small items at the camp store. As time passed, some prisoners began to form a kind of temporary life in the camps. They built small gardens, played soccer, and even put on plays or concerts. This created a strange and sometimes uneasy atmosphere. On one hand, they were enemy soldiers. On the other hand, they were men far from home, caught in a war they could no longer fight. Local civilians often saw the prisoners working in nearby fields. At first, there was suspicion and anger. These were the same men whose army had bombed cities and killed American soldiers. But over time, some townspeople began to see them as individuals rather than symbols of the enemy. A few even developed friendships, though such connections were closely watched by the authorities. The experience of those first days in camp stayed with many prisoners for the rest of their lives. The shock of stepping off a transport ship expecting brutality, only to be given a hot shower and clean clothes, marked a turning point. It was a moment when fear gave way to confusion, and confusion slowly shifted into a new understanding of the war and the people on the other side of it. The transport of German prisoners of war to the United States followed a strict and organized system. After capture, groups of German soldiers were gathered at holding areas near the front lines. From there, they were marched to ports under Allied control. These movements were heavily guarded, with armed escorts positioned along the routes to prevent escape. At the docks, the prisoners boarded Liberty ships, the same type of cargo vessels used to move weapons, supplies, and troops across the Atlantic. Each ship carried hundreds of men. Conditions were crowded, and the air below deck was stale and hot. The prisoners slept on wooden bunks stacked in tiers, packed closely together. They were fed basic meals and given water at scheduled times. Guards patrolled the passageways and watched every movement. The voyage itself was dangerous. U-boats hunted Allied shipping, and many prisoners understood the risk. They had served on German vessels or seen firsthand what happened when ships were torpedoed. Some prisoners stayed silent during the crossing. Others whispered in the dark, wondering what would happen when they reached the far shore. A few believed they were being taken to their deaths, convinced by Nazi propaganda that Americans would kill them once they were no longer useful. When the ships finally reached ports in the United States, usually on the east or Gulf coasts, the disembarkation process began. Prisoners were lined up and counted before being marched off the ship. Military police surrounded the area, rifles ready. Trucks and trains waited nearby to transport the men to inland camps. These convoys moved quickly, avoiding large cities to prevent crowds from gathering. The goal was to keep the movement quiet and orderly. Upon arrival at a camp, the prisoners went through processing. The first step was to remove everything they carried. Old uniforms, boots, belts, and personal items were taken away. Most of the clothing was filthy, tattered, and crawling with lice. The soldiers were then sent through delousing stations. Powder was applied to kill insects and prevent infestations from spreading inside the camp. The next step was the shower. Many of the prisoners had not bathed in weeks. They filed into rooms fitted with multiple showerheads. For some, this moment triggered deep fear. Stories from the front about mass killings by gas were common. Interpreters and guards explained that the showers were safe and meant for hygiene. Slowly, the men stepped under the warm water. The smell of soap filled the room. Dirt, sweat, and lice were washed away. It was a simple act, but it marked a major change for the prisoners, both physically and mentally. After bathing, they were examined by medical teams. Doctors checked for wounds, infections, and diseases. Those with serious conditions were sent to infirmaries. This was part of the U.S. Army's commitment to follow the Geneva Convention. Every prisoner, no matter his rank, was to receive proper care. Once cleared, each man received a set of American-issued prison uniforms. These were plain, durable, and clearly marked to prevent confusion with U.S. military clothing. The prisoners were also given clean socks, underwear, and well-fitting shoes. Their appearance changed almost instantly. They no longer looked like ragged soldiers pulled from the battlefield. They looked like men ready to work and live under a strict but stable system. The camps themselves were built with a clear layout. Rows of wooden barracks provided sleeping quarters. Each barracks had bunks, stoves for heat, and small windows for ventilation. Mess halls were located near the center of the camp, with kitchens that prepared food for thousands of men. Medical buildings were staffed with doctors, nurses, and orderlies. There were also areas set aside for religious services and counseling. Guard towers ringed the perimeter, and barbed wire fences stood between the prisoners and freedom. Life inside the camp followed a schedule. Breakfast was served at the same time each morning, followed by work assignments or roll call. Meals were plain but consistent, often including meat, bread, and vegetables. For many prisoners, the food was better than what they had received in the German army, especially during the later years of the war when rations at the front were scarce and poor in quality. Clean water was always available, and sanitation was closely monitored to prevent disease. Prisoners were not kept idle. The U.S. faced labor shortages as American men fought overseas. POWs were put to work under strict guidelines. Many were assigned to farms, where they planted and harvested crops. Others worked in lumber mills, canning factories, or on construction projects. These assignments kept the camps productive and supported the home front. The work was not unpaid. Prisoners received a small wage in the form of camp-issued currency. This money could be spent at the camp store to buy tobacco, soap, stationery, or simple treats. It gave the men a sense of normalcy and allowed them to make personal choices within the limits of captivity. Recreation and education were also part of camp life. Soccer fields and open spaces were provided for physical activity. Some camps even organized classes, with prisoners teaching each other subjects like mathematics, languages, or mechanics. This was allowed because it kept the men occupied and reduced tension. Security remained a constant priority. Guards watched the camp around the clock. Roll calls were frequent, and movement was tightly controlled. Escape attempts were rare, but precautions were always in place. Most prisoners understood that escaping into the vastness of the United States was nearly impossible and would likely end in capture or death. Over time, the structure and predictability of camp life created a strange sense of stability. Men who had once lived in fear of sudden attack now lived within a clear set of rules. For many, the experience of being processed, cleaned, clothed, and fed was their first step into a world that was utterly different from the battlefield they had left behind. The first German prisoners of war stepped off the transport ships with their shoulders tense and their eyes scanning every movement around them. They had spent weeks on crowded decks, listening to the creak of the ship and the bark of orders they could not always understand. As they were marched down the gangplanks, they expected to be hit, kicked, or cursed at. Some looked around for signs of a firing squad, believing their capture was the first step toward certain death. These fears were not born out of imagination alone. For months, Nazi propaganda had painted a vivid picture of American cruelty. German newspapers and radio broadcasts told soldiers that if they surrendered, they would be starved, beaten, or experimented on. Captured troops would be humiliated, forced to live like animals, and then killed when they were no longer useful. Many of the men had seen the effects of war on civilians and on prisoners taken by their own army. They assumed their enemy would behave the same way. When they were marched under guard to the trucks and trains waiting to take them inland, their faces were grim and their jaws clenched. Some muttered prayers under their breath. Others swore silently to escape at the first chance. A few were too exhausted to think at all. When the convoy reached the camp gates, the prisoners were ordered to line up. Guards watched from towers and along the fence line, rifles held steady. The prisoners braced themselves. The orders continued to come, translated by interpreters brought in for that purpose. The men were told to remove their clothing and place it in piles. This command alone stirred deep fear. German officers and senior NCOs tried to keep their men calm, but many prisoners were terrified. The idea of being stripped, marched into a room, and sealed inside matched too closely the rumors they had heard about mass executions. As they were herded into the shower area, panic rose in some. A few refused to move forward. Their eyes darted toward the ceiling, toward the walls, toward any vent or pipe that could be used to pump in poison gas. Interpreters spoke quickly, explaining that these were showers, nothing more. The guards remained firm but did not strike the prisoners. Slowly, the first men stepped inside. Warm water poured down. Soap was handed out. Dirt and sweat ran off their bodies in brown rivulets. The fear gave way to silence, and then to a kind of stunned relief. One German sergeant later said he had wept as the water hit his back. It was the first time he had felt clean in months. For a brief moment, he no longer felt like a soldier or a prisoner, just a human being. Around him, other men experienced the same shock. They had expected cruelty, and instead they found care. The next surprise came in the mess hall. After processing, the men were marched to eat. They shuffled into line, still wary. The food was served on trays. Meat, bread, vegetables, and coffee. It was more than many of them had eaten in days. The portions were generous, the smell inviting. Yet some men hesitated. They examined the food closely, suspecting poison. Only after watching others take the first bites did they begin to eat. Hunger overcame suspicion. For many, the first hot meal in captivity was a turning point. These moments were not accidents. The United States had a strategy behind every step. Military planners understood that the way prisoners were treated could influence the behavior of German units still in the field. If surrender meant survival and even decent living conditions, enemy soldiers might be more willing to lay down their arms. If surrender meant torture or death, they would fight harder and longer. By showing captured soldiers a level of respect and order, the U.S. aimed to break the grip of Nazi propaganda. Every clean uniform, every warm shower, every well-cooked meal was a message. It said that the enemy they had been taught to hate was not what they had been told. This approach also served a practical purpose. Well-fed, healthy prisoners were easier to manage. Camps with strict but fair rules were less likely to erupt in violence. Inside the camps, the guards walked a careful line. They enforced discipline with firmness but avoided unnecessary cruelty. Prisoners who followed the rules were left alone. Those who broke them faced swift but measured punishment. Interpreters played a key role, explaining regulations and answering questions. This helped calm tensions and prevent misunderstandings. The shock of the first days in camp lingered. Some prisoners remained suspicious, convinced that the kindness was temporary and that the real punishment would come later. Others began to relax, to trust the routines and the rules. Letters home reflected this range of reactions. One man wrote that he had been treated better as a prisoner than as a soldier under German officers. Another warned his family not to believe American lies, insisting that everything he saw was a trick. Over time, patterns emerged. Men who had once been enemies began to adapt to camp life. They worked, ate, and slept according to schedules. They played soccer in the yard, wrote letters, and even sang songs together at night. But the memory of those first encounters, the terror in the showers, the disbelief at the sight of full plates of food, never faded. For the Americans running the camps, these reactions were proof that their strategy was working. Each prisoner who realized he was safe was another blow to Nazi control. The camp became more than just a holding facility. It was a quiet battlefield of ideas, where actions spoke louder than words. Every guard who followed the rules, every doctor who treated a wound, every interpreter who reassured a frightened man played a part in that fight. What began as fear and suspicion slowly turned into something else. In the space between capture and confinement, between propaganda and reality, a new understanding began to take shape. It was not friendship and it was not forgiveness. It was simply the recognition that even in war, there were choices about how to treat an enemy, and those choices could change the course of the conflict itself. The line of prisoners moved slowly toward the shower building. The guards shouted orders while interpreters repeated the commands in German. The men shuffled forward, their boots scuffing the dirt. Many were hollow-eyed and unsteady, their uniforms stiff with dirt and sweat. Among them was a sergeant named Otto, no older than 25 but already aged by months of fighting. His cheeks were sunken, his skin pale beneath the grime, and lice crawled in his hair and beard. When he reached the doorway and saw the rows of shower heads and steam rising inside, he froze. Otto's breath quickened. The sight matched the terrible stories he had heard back in Germany. Stories about prisoners being herded into rooms, locked inside, and killed with poison gas. His mind told him to run, though there was nowhere to go. He tried to step back, but the men behind him pressed forward. His heart pounded as his legs locked. An interpreter rushed over, speaking in calm, measured German. The words came slowly at first. "This is a shower, you are safe. There is no danger here." Still, Otto hesitated. Finally, one of his fellow prisoners walked past him into the room. Otto saw the man turn his face up to the warm spray, saw his shoulders sag with relief. Only then did Otto take a step forward. The water was hot and clean. Soap was passed down the line. Otto stood under the spray and felt the dirt slide from his skin. He rubbed his arms and chest, and tears welled in his eyes. In that moment, he was no longer a soldier or a prisoner. He was simply a man who had been given a chance to feel human again. Later, he would recall that moment as the first time he understood that his captors were not the monsters he had been told to expect. After the showers, the men received new clothing. They were issued plain, sturdy uniforms marked with PW to show they were prisoners. The fabric was rough but clean. Otto held his new shirt in his hands and thought of his younger brother, still fighting on the Eastern Front. He imagined his brother's torn and frozen coat, soaked with mud and blood, and the contrast made his throat tighten. When Otto sat down to his first meal in the mess hall, the feeling returned. The plate held meat, potatoes, and bread, more food than he had seen in weeks. He ate slowly at first, suspicious of what he did not understand. Then hunger took over. Around him, other prisoners did the same. Some spoke quietly to each other, comparing the taste and portion sizes to what they had last eaten in German field kitchens. Many agreed that they were eating better here in captivity than their families back home. Letters written by prisoners often carried this same tone of disbelief. They described warm showers, clean beds, and good food. They spoke of fair treatment and orderly routines. Some of these letters were carefully censored before leaving the camp, but enough details remained to reveal a truth the men could not hide. Their experiences were far from what they had been told by their officers and their government. The reaction from the Americans who ran the camps was complex. Guards who had expected hardened, dangerous killers were often surprised. Many of the prisoners were young, some barely out of their teens. Others were old enough to be fathers or even grandfathers. A few guards spoke of feeling conflicted when they saw how thin and tired the prisoners were. These were the same men whose army had killed American soldiers overseas, yet in front of them stood individuals who looked less like enemies and more like victims of a vast and brutal machine. In nearby towns, curiosity and suspicion mixed in equal measure. Civilians watched the prisoners being marched to work details outside the camp. Some crossed the street rather than get too close. Others stopped to stare openly, whispering to each other about the sight of enemy soldiers in their community. Local newspapers printed stories about the camps, feeding both fear and fascination. Over time, the presence of the prisoners became less shocking. People saw them working in fields, fixing fences, and hauling supplies. They began to see individuals rather than faceless enemies. On farms, a strange kind of relationship formed. The labor shortage caused by the war meant that farmers relied on the prisoners to plant, harvest, and care for livestock. At first, interactions were stiff and guarded. Farmers spoke through gestures or a few learned German words. The prisoners answered politely, unsure how far they could go. Over weeks and months, trust grew. Farmers brought extra food or shared coffee during breaks. Prisoners showed pride in doing good work, even under guard. In some places, friendships quietly developed, though such bonds were carefully watched by authorities. Otto's own work detail brought him to a small farm outside the camp. The farmer's son was fighting in Italy, and his absence left the family struggling. Otto fixed broken equipment, lifted heavy sacks of grain, and milked cows. The farmer's wife sometimes set out a jug of cool water on hot days. Though no words were exchanged, the gesture was understood. Otto would later write that these moments felt strange but comforting, like reminders of home. Inside the camp, the prisoners built a semblance of community. They played soccer in the yard, sang familiar songs at night, and organized classes to pass the time. Guards stood watch, but they allowed these activities. For the Americans, this was practical. Prisoners who were busy and engaged were easier to control. For the prisoners, it was a lifeline. It gave them a sense of purpose and a way to hold on to their identities. The early days of capture remained vivid in their memories. Otto never forgot the terror he felt at the shower door, nor the overwhelming relief that followed. Others shared similar stories. These moments became part of the camp's quiet history, told and retold among the men. They spoke of fear, of kindness, and of the confusion that came when the enemy treated them better than their own leaders had promised. For both sides, these experiences reshaped their understanding of the war. The Germans began to see their captors as human beings rather than shadows from propaganda. The Americans, in turn, saw that the men they guarded were not just enemies but individuals caught in a conflict far larger than themselves. Over time, this mutual recognition did not erase the war, but it did change how they lived through it, day by day, behind the camp's fences and watchtowers. The impact of how the United States treated German prisoners of war reached far beyond the fences of the camps. At first, the men who arrived in America were silent about what they saw. Many were cautious, unsure of what would happen to them or whether they would survive to see the end of the war. But as weeks passed, stories began to spread among the prisoners. They talked to each other in the barracks and during work details, comparing their experiences of capture and transport. They spoke of warm showers, clean beds, and the surprising quality of the food. Some of these stories reached the front lines. German prisoners were allowed to write letters home, though every letter was censored before being sent. The censors removed military details but allowed personal comments. Even a few sentences describing good treatment carried weight. A line about having plenty to eat or being treated fairly by the guards stood in sharp contrast to the propaganda soldiers had been fed by their own government. When families in Germany read these letters, they shared them with neighbors, friends, and local soldiers on leave. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of what life in American captivity was actually like. As more soldiers were captured and sent to the United States, the stories grew harder to dismiss. Men returning from the front with leave passes sometimes overheard these accounts and carried them back to their units. The result was subtle but powerful. In the later stages of the war, especially after the heavy losses in North Africa and Italy, German soldiers began to see surrender in a new light. They no longer believed that capture by the Americans meant certain death. For some, this shift changed the way they fought. Instead of holding out to the last bullet, entire groups chose to lay down their arms. Allied commanders noticed a steady increase in surrenders. In some battles, German units marched forward with white flags, hoping to be captured rather than destroyed. This change was no accident. American military planners understood that humane treatment of prisoners was more than a legal obligation. It was also a weapon. Every well-fed prisoner who returned to the front in a letter or a rumor was a living message. It told other soldiers that there was an alternative to fighting and dying for a collapsing regime. The United States did not broadcast this message through leaflets or radio speeches alone. It was carried in the memories and voices of the captured men themselves. While this shift affected the battlefield, the camps served another purpose that was less visible but equally important. Behind the fences, a quiet war of information was taking place. Interrogation teams worked methodically, questioning prisoners about troop movements, supply lines, and weapon production. These interrogations followed rules laid out by the Geneva Convention. Physical harm was not permitted, but skilled interrogators relied on psychology, patience, and careful listening. Some prisoners provided valuable details willingly. Others let information slip during casual conversations. In the barracks, mess halls, and work crews, camp personnel listened closely. A careless remark about a new type of tank or a unit's location could reveal patterns the U.S. military needed to plan future operations. Even the prisoners who tried to stay silent often gave away clues through their reactions or their choice of words. To support this effort, the camps were designed to separate groups of prisoners by rank and loyalty. High-ranking officers were often isolated, while lower-ranking soldiers were placed with men from different units. This prevented organized resistance and made it easier to gather information. Sometimes, informants were planted among the prisoners. These informants reported on camp politics, escape plans, and secret conversations. The intelligence gathered in these camps helped shape Allied strategies. Reports about German troop movements informed decisions about where to attack and when to push forward. Information about production shortages revealed weaknesses in the German war machine. Even small details, like the morale of specific divisions, allowed planners to predict how an enemy unit might react under pressure. The contrast between the way the Americans treated prisoners and the way the Nazis treated theirs also had a wider effect. Stories of U.S. camps reached beyond the German army. Civilians who heard them began to question the official line of the Nazi government. At the same time, reports of Nazi brutality against Allied prisoners circulated through the Allied ranks and the public. The difference between the two systems was stark. American soldiers captured by Germany often faced harsh conditions. Many were starved, beaten, or forced to march long distances without food or water. News of these mistreatments reached home and fueled anger. By comparison, the treatment of German POWs in the U.S. demonstrated a clear commitment to international law. This contrast became a tool for American propaganda. Photographs of clean, healthy German prisoners working in fields or playing soccer were published in newspapers and shown in newsreels. These images reassured the American public that their country was fighting with honor. The presence of German prisoners on American soil also shaped local communities. Farmers and factory owners who worked alongside the prisoners often shared their impressions with friends and family. These personal accounts reinforced the larger narrative of humane treatment. As more people encountered the prisoners, the idea of the enemy became more complex. These were no longer faceless soldiers from a distant war but individuals with names, families, and histories. Back at the front, the cumulative effect of all these factors could be measured in the numbers. As the war dragged on, Allied forces captured increasing numbers of German soldiers with less resistance. Some of these men walked into captivity carrying their rifles held high in surrender. Others abandoned their positions and slipped away to be captured later. Each surrender weakened the German army's ability to fight and shortened the war by degrees. The camps themselves continued to operate as part of this larger effort. They were more than holding areas. They were psychological tools, intelligence centers, and living proof of a different way to fight a war. The choices made behind the fences influenced decisions on distant battlefields and even shaped the thoughts of men still entrenched in the fight. For the prisoners, the experience was personal and immediate. For the Allied command, it was strategic and far-reaching. What happened in those camps was not just about feeding and housing captured men. It was about shifting the balance of the war, one prisoner, one story, and one letter at a time. When the war ended, the camps that had once been filled with German prisoners began to empty. Victory in Europe was declared in May 1945, and the long process of sending men home began. Many of these prisoners had been in the United States for months, some for years. They had worked on farms, built roads, and lived under a system of rules that, while strict, had treated them with dignity. Now they would return to a country shattered by defeat. The return journey was slow and carefully managed. Groups of prisoners were loaded onto trains and trucks, then taken back to ports for the voyage across the Atlantic. This time the ships carried them east back toward Germany. As they traveled, many prisoners were filled with mixed emotions. Some were eager to see their families again, to walk familiar streets, to rebuild their lives. Others feared what they would find. Their homes might be destroyed, their families gone, their towns unrecognizable. Otto, the sergeant who had once frozen in terror at the camp showers, was among those making the journey home. He had spent nearly 2 years in a camp in Iowa, working the fields and learning a few words of English. During that time, he had come to see his captors not as faceless enemies but as people. He remembered the farmer who had offered him water on a hot day and the guard who quietly gave him paper to write letters. Those small acts stayed with him. When Otto stepped onto German soil again, he saw devastation everywhere. Buildings were reduced to rubble. Roads were broken. The faces of the people he passed were gaunt and wary. Germany was no longer the proud nation he had been told he was fighting for. It was a land in ruins, occupied by foreign armies and struggling to survive. In conversations with friends and family, Otto spoke about his time in the United States. At first, many did not believe him. The idea that enemy soldiers had been given hot showers, Clean clothes and decent food seemed impossible. Some accused him of lying or of being brainwashed by propaganda. But Otto was not alone. Thousands of other former prisoners told similar stories. Piece by piece, the truth became harder to deny. For some men, this experience sparked a change in how they viewed the world. They had seen a different system, one built on rules and laws rather than fear and brutality. These men carried those ideas back with them. In the years after the war, as Germany began to rebuild, a number of former prisoners became voices for cooperation between Germany and the United States. They understood firsthand that there had been another way to fight the war, one that did not rely solely on violence. The effects were not just political. In many small towns across Germany, people heard about life in the American camps through letters and stories shared in kitchens and workshops. These accounts shaped how civilians thought about the enemy. They challenged the Nazi narrative that had dominated for so long. Over time, this contributed to a broader shift in German society as people reconsidered what they had been taught. Back in the United States, the camps themselves began to take on new meaning. When the last prisoners left, some camps were dismantled. The barracks were torn down, and the land returned to farming or other uses. But in certain places, parts of the camps were preserved. Local communities recognized the historical significance of what had happened there. Camp Algona in Iowa became one such site. Years later, a museum was built to tell the story of the camp and the men who had lived there. Visitors can see photographs, letters, and artifacts from the era. They can walk the grounds and imagine what it was like when the camp was filled with men who had once fought under the German flag. These museums serve as reminders of a time when war reached deep into the heart of the United States, not through battle, but through the presence of captured soldiers. The legacy of these camps also lives on in international law. The treatment of German prisoners during World War II set a standard that influenced how future conflicts were managed. The Geneva Convention, which had guided U.S. policy during the war, was strengthened in the years that followed. Nations saw that humane treatment of prisoners was not only morally right but strategically sound. It kept camps stable, reduced resistance, and even weakened the enemy's resolve. This approach proved that the way prisoners are treated can have consequences far beyond the camp fences. By following the rules, the United States showed that war could be fought without abandoning principles. This example stood in sharp contrast to the actions of regimes that used cruelty as a weapon. The difference was visible not just in reports and photographs, but in the lives of the men who experienced it. For former prisoners like Otto, the memory of those days never faded. He often spoke of his first moments in captivity, the fear as he stepped into the shower, the disbelief when he received a clean uniform, the shock of tasting food that was both hot and plentiful. These memories shaped how he saw the world. When he spoke to his children and grandchildren, he described the war not only as a time of destruction but also as a time when he glimpsed another way of living. Many other men carried similar stories. Some returned to visit the United States years later, this time as free men and guests rather than captives. They sought out the places where they had once been held, standing quietly where barracks had stood or walking through small town streets where they had once labored in the fields. These visits were deeply personal, but they also served a broader purpose. They reminded both nations of the choices made during the war and the lasting effects of those choices. The relationships built between former prisoners and the communities that once held them became part of the fabric of post-war peace. The story of the camps is not one of perfection. There were moments of hardship, anger, and conflict. But taken as a whole, the experience demonstrated that humane treatment can be a tool of war as powerful as any weapon. It can undermine enemy ideology, weaken loyalty to oppressive systems, and plant seeds of change that grow long after the fighting ends. What happened inside those camps was more than a matter of military necessity. It was a lesson, carried across oceans and generations, about how the treatment of even the most bitter enemy can shape the future in ways no one could have imagined when the war began.